I'm sure you all recognize this man right here. This man's ultimately responsible for this MacBook and this iPhone right here. This man is Steve Jobs, and he's responsible for basically every Apple product that we have today. His life can be divided into three main parts: his early life, his time at Apple, and then his later life and his death. I'm Aiden Wagner, and I'm going to tell you more about Steve Jobs. He was born in San Francisco in 1955 to Abdul Fattah Jandali and Joanne Schiebel, but he was soon put up for adoption because his parents weren't married and they didn't want a child. So Paul and Claire Jobs adopted him, and they lived in what is now known as Silicon Valley in California. And his dad was an engineer, and his dad would show him in the garage how to take electronics apart and how to put them back together again. And this started a passion for electronics in a young Steve Jobs. And when he was in school, he got in a lot of trouble because he was really smart and nothing really challenged him. So he would just pull pranks on the teacher and mess with them, basically, until fourth grade, until his fourth grade teacher bribed him to study, and then he soon realized how useful the information he was learning actually was, and he started getting really good grades, and his teachers tried to pass him on to high school, which he declined because he was a little bit of an outcast and not really accepted socially at school, and that would just make it worse. So he would go through middle school and high school, and he would graduate high school, and we'd go to Reed College in Oregon. However, he'd drop out, and he'd go in and out of classes, and his favorite class was calligraphy, which kind of has an influence on the Mac, like Apple and their fonts and stuff. He really loved when things looked nice. But he would drop out of college, and he would go live in a hippie commune. And he lived there for a couple months, and his main job was to pick apples. But he'd get a job at Atari, and he'd meet Steve Wozniak there, but that'll come into play later. And after working at Atari for a while, he went to India, and in India, he tried to find himself, and he did a lot of drugs, and he did a lot of stuff, and then he came back, and he was like a different man, a changed man, and he had a vision, and he got with Steve Wozniak, and together they started Apple Incorporated in their garage, in Steve's garage, and from there, they had started a revolution with computers. They made computers smaller, they made them cheaper, and they made them way more accessible for the common person. With the Apple II, which was their second computer they made, it revolutionized Apple, and it skyrocketed their sales and made them very popular among the tech world. In 1984, they would release the Macintosh, which is what really set them apart from every other company. But soon after the Macintosh's release, Apple would start to suffer a lot because they weren't really coming out with new stuff. And so everybody blamed Steve Jobs for it, and ultimately he would be removed from any type of creative processes at Apple. So he left, and he would start Next Technology, which was just like Apple basically, but it was his own thing. And it would turn out to be a flop. It was a huge failure. He didn't really get anywhere with it. But also, he started Pixar. He was one of the three founding fathers at Pixar. And it's not really a very well-known fact about him, but he was one of the three founding fathers at Pixar. And he would remain the CEO at Pixar until 2006 when Disney would buy them out. And he made a lot of money from this. But he took this hiatus while he was away from Apple to focus on his family, on his wife, and his newborn son. However, Apple, without Steve Jobs, was suffering. They were going almost bankrupt. So, the then Apple CEO, Steve Jobs, convinced him to buy Next. And so, Steve Jobs would come back to Apple. And from there, Jobs took over. He ushered in a new wave at Apple. And in 1998, he released the iMac, which is basically what started all the modern Apple products. So about after 3 years, Jobs brought Apple back to where they were really popular, and they were pumping out really good new stuff. And his effective advertisements and is revolutionizing his ingenious products with what he was making out there. And he went against the grain. When he was came back to Apple, he would start opening retail stores, which was something that people thought was going out of date and was stupid. And he went against the grain, and he thought that at an Apple store where there's only Apple employees and Apple products, people could really see how good the Macintosh, the MacBook, all the Apple products were. So Jobs made landmark deals with a bunch of people with Apple, and he would soon release iTunes. And with the iTunes, you could use your music on your computer, and it was just this brand new thing that no one had done beforehand. And soon after that, he would create the iPod, which is what revolutionized what we know today as like mobile phones and everything. Which, when iPod and iTunes came together, it's what everyone knew just back in the day as it was like its own thing. Your iPod and your iTunes was just really cool back in the day. And so this made Jobs realize Apple's potential as a worldwide company, and he started to create a tablet. And this tablet, he soon realized, could be pushed into the size of a phone, and this is where the iPhone would come from. And the iPhone, he said, was an iPod, a phone, and an internet communication all in one tool. And this just really was what was his biggest landmark, basically, as the Apple CEO. And this brings me into the next part of his life, his later life, and his death. So in 2003, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and his past as a hippie, he tried alternative treatments for about 9 months, which nothing worked. So, after 9 months, he got surgery in 2004, and he was healthy for about 4 or 5 years until 2008. His cancer returned, and people could start to see a decline in his health. However, besides this fact, in 2010, he would launch the iPad, which is his last final statement at Apple. And from there, his health would decline, and in 2011, he resigned as the CEO of Apple. And in 2011, on August 24th, 2011, is when he resigned. October 5th, 2011 is when he died after he watched the release of the iPhone 4S. So in conclusion, Steve Jobs was a very successful entrepreneur. His legacy is still alive with every piece of Apple technology that we have. His last words were, "Oh wow," and I would like to end with a quote, and it was from him. It says, "I like to believe there's an afterlife. I like to believe the accumulated wisdom doesn't just disappear when you die, but somehow it endures." Thank you.